Wszystko zaczęło się od króla Jagiełły. Mała Łodzia stała się miastem, które w XIX wieku rozwijało się najszybciej na świecie. W ciągu zaledwie 60 lat od powstania pierwszej manufaktury powstaje przemysłowa, wielonarodowościowa metropolia. Jednak wiatry historii nie zawsze jej sprzyjały. To, co zniszczył los, odbudowują łodzianie. Nasza Łódź. Miasto wielkich szans. Od 600 lat w sercu Polski i Europy.
Jesteśmy Polakami. Jesteśmy niezwykłym społeczeństwem. Zawsze w obliczu wielkiego wyzwania potrafimy się mobilizować. Potrafimy stawić czoła wielkim wyzwaniom. Bo nie potrafimy stać obojętnie. Bo obchodzi nas bezpieczeństwo i przyszłość naszych dzieci. Bo wierzymy, że nadzieja zwycięża apatię, lęk i strach. Bo mimo wszelkich przeciwności nigdy się nie poddajemy. Potrafimy ciężko pracować, wspierać się i działać razem. Bo zależy nam na naszej ojczyźnie, naszym osiedlu, naszej ulicy. Bo chcemy naszych niezbywalnych praw i wolności. Bo nie oddamy naszych marzeń. Nadchodzi punkt zwrotny.
Ladies and gentlemen, the name mentioned in the topic of the next presentation is the one we would like to forget. And I hope that not strategists or politicians, but only historians will be dealing with it in the future. Putin and the future of geopolitics in Central and Eastern Europe. That's the title of the next presentation to be delivered by Mark Galeotti, who is the leading expert in the area of Russian security. He studied history at Cambridge, did his PhD in LSE, and after working for Foreign Office was a scientist and expert in London, New York, Moscow, Prague and Florence. He is the chair of the British consulting company Mayak Intelligence. He is the honorary professor at the UCL and senior cooperator of RUSI. His last books, Putin's Wars, The Weaponization of Everything We Need to Talk About Putin, and The Vori, Russia's super mafia. Ladies and gentlemen, let's invite Mark Galeotti.
Well, hello. Delighted to be here, and I'm meant to be talking about Putin, the geopolitics of Central Europe, in 17 minutes and 7 seconds. Now, look, I'm from the UK, and we are famous or infamous for always wanting to use humour when we present, and sometimes that's almost a bit problematic. I was talking to some Ukrainian parliamentarians a little while back, and I was very tempted to say that they should be putting up statues of Putin in all their main squares as the father of the modern Ukrainian nation. I thought that might be a joke too far, though, and thought better of it. But here's the interesting thing. It's true. If one thinks about Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in February of last year, clearly driven by a desire to assert Russia's great power status, to demonstrate that Russia is a force in the world, and for himself personally, to elevate himself up into the ranks of Russia's great state-building heroes of history. And what has he achieved? A military that he spent 20 years dumping resources into to modernize, that has been burnt through and is increasingly being armed with retooled weapons from the 1960s. Russia itself, for all the fact that it still is able to cultivate relationships with China and elsewhere, but it has no friends. It is increasingly a pariah that has to pay for any kind of support it gets. Even North Korea, it is having to offer deals to in order to get the ammunition, the sub-quality ammunition that it needs. When Russia loses, and Russia will lose, what will Russia be like? But also, what will Ukraine be like? I mean, through the furnace of this terrible, terrible war, the new Ukrainian nation is being born. Of course, they're not totally disappeared, but all the old divisions that held Ukraine back and apart, between East and West, between Catholic and Orthodox, between the cities and the countryside, all of these divisions are becoming less and less meaningful. A state-building project which has time and time again, ever since 1991, tried and then failed to accomplish its aim, is now being born. Putin has created Ukraine, and let that be carved on his headstone when he dies. But let's look further, and given the time, I just want to raise 3 points about the impact of Putin and Putin's wars on Central Europe. And the first one, and it's one that really is going to be building off comments that you heard from people such as President Ilves in the earlier panel, is that Central Europe matters again. Sure, one can go back in history and talk about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but we all know that especially since 1989, there has been, on the part of Western Europe and beyond, a rather patronizing sense that Central Europe were the poor relations. Central Europe was a place that had things done to it, oppressed under the Soviets, lifted up by the European Union, but essentially lacking in agency. That is changing. Increasingly, I mean, we actually are seeing, without again wanting to overplay it, but the center of gravity within the West shifting. Whether it's in terms of countries that are asserting themselves increasingly, I mean, one can look at Poland, whether or not a 300,000 personnel army is achievable, but nonetheless, Poland is definitely building itself up with an aim to being shall I say, hard powerhouse of Europe. Whether we're looking at other countries, take the Czech Republic, which I lived there for just over a couple of years. And I must admit, I made myself incredibly unpopular at times with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs because of my criticizing Czech foreign policy. Or more to the point, my criticizing the fact that Czech foreign policy seemed at that time to be not to have a foreign policy. Now, though, we've actually seen the Czechs stand up and be much, much more assertive. And you see, assertive does not necessarily have to mean belligerent or hostile. It just simply means active. I think we really have seen not just Central Europe be much more active, but other parts of the world begin to appreciate that. Central Europe is not just simply the playground, the battleground, the market ground for others. So in this respect, Putin has actually woken up a region, and more to the point, woken up other people to the importance of a region. Secondly, the nature of security has changed. Here's one of the ironies about the Ukrainian war. Putin was at war with Ukraine for a long time before his tanks rolled in February of last year. But primarily, until then, he was fighting an economic and political war. And here's the irony. Until he invaded, Putin was winning. He'd assembled a massive army on Ukraine's borders. Faced with the constant threat of Russian invasion, investors were fleeing Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy was increasingly in crisis. A stream of Western visitors were going to Moscow, putting Putin exactly where he wants to be, in that position of centrality, that others have to come to him and petition him for something. In other words, for him to not invade. And indeed, there were some Western governments and Western leaders that were actually beginning to try and put pressure on Kyiv to make concessions to Moscow, precisely in order to avert war. If Putin really had been this grand master of four-dimensional geopolitical chess that we're sometimes told, he would have just sat back and let this continue. But he didn't. He got impatient. He got lazy. He was so seduced by his own beliefs about Ukraine, that Ukraine was not a real country, the Ukrainians not a real people, that they could quickly be annexed, in effect, and that the West would just sit back and wring its hands and complain and wag its fingers and do nothing, which, in fairness, is what the West has done in the past. That he invaded, and the point at which he did that, the point at which he found himself embroiled in a real war, is, as I said, the point at which he started losing. Now, starting to lose is not quite the same as losing. Even if the Ukrainians drive every single Russian soldier off every single square centimeter of occupied land, that does not end the war. It merely moves the front line to the national border. Russia will still be free to lob missiles at Ukrainian cities, to carry out cyber attacks and subversion, to regroup its forces and go back into Ukraine anytime it chooses. Real security is something that's much, much harder to achieve, and quite frankly, it'll be very hard to see it achieved so long as Putin is in the Kremlin. And this is, after all, the nature of modern war, that it is not just fought through guns and bombs. I mean, if we're honest, we are at war with Russia. It's an economic war fought through sanctions. It's a political war. It's a legal war. It's fought on so many other battlefields, but because we are not willing to, for entirely understandable reasons, actually put our soldiers into the fire, we are fighting this separate parallel war with Russia. And this is the nature of modern warfare. This is what Russia had been, after all, fighting against Ukraine. I would also happen to mention, by the by, it's also a key theme of my book, The Weaponization of Everything, which has been translated into Polish, as I think everyone is a weapon, and is available in the bookstore here. Just mentioning for your information. But that is also a challenge for us. NATO has been revived. We are seeing belatedly and still not enough money being spent on national defense by countries, and I wouldn't want to name any of them in particular because it would embarrass the Germans, but countries that really should know better are finally beginning to spend more. And indeed, we see Poland with its sort of massive purchases of missiles, attack helicopters, tanks, and the like. But this is only part of the equation. Actually, we also face a threat that will come from all these other different types of warfare, whether it's the Russians or whether it's someone else, the Chinese, whoever. I mean, this is the nature of modern warfare, and Putin has, again, inadvertently, accidentally done us a favor by demonstrating actually how many different ways wars can be fought today. And this is also going to be a challenge for Central Europe. And the answer is not just soldiers, it is resilience. It is actually learning how to cope with the whole variety of different types of attack that you may face. And in some ways, the parallel here is with terrorism. You do everything you can to stop terrorism, to stop the bombers, the assassins, or whatever from achieving their targets. But sometimes, some of them will get through. And therefore, you also need to be resilient enough to cope with that, to keep on going, to keep calm and carry on, as the older slogan goes. And here again, we have an interesting both challenge and opportunity for Central Europe. I mean, firstly, it's precisely that, in fact, in some ways one has to recognize that Russian or other assaults come through the vulnerable points. Their disinformation campaigns, for example, they cannot change minds magically. What they do is they take existing fault lines within society and try and pull them further and further apart. So in other words, actually the best responses to disinformation is not having fact checkers and myth debunkers and so forth. It is actually having societies which are more willing to believe their own governments, their own media, than some bizarre rumor that they heard on the internet. And how do we do that? Well, a lot of that is up to us. It's about politicians perhaps not being quite so freeform with the truth, shall we say. It's actually about being much more aware of isolated and marginalized elements of our own societies, which otherwise would be easy prey. I mean, generally, we have to recognize that the countries of Central Europe do have challenges which range from the integrity of their internet infrastructures, all the way to, in some cases, the integrity of their political systems. That also needs to be a battlefront that we address. And it's one, actually, in which countries can collaborate much more effectively. We tend to think that military security is something we do collectively through NATO. But all other forms of security, every country is on its own. Well, that's something that, in fact, Central Europe, like so many other parts of the world, needs to relearn. There is advantages to cooperation in all aspects of security. But finally, here's a difficult thing for us to really appreciate. The long-term security of Central Europe depends on a happy, prosperous, and stable Russia. Unfortunately, that Russia is at the moment well over the horizon. But nonetheless, what happens in Russia will be of constant and crucial interest to Central Europe, because Russia is not going to go away. Russia is not about to fragment any more than Russia is about to become a happy, democratic, liberal country the moment that Putin fails to wake up one morning. But let me close by bringing in a slight note of unfashionable optimism here. Losing an empire, losing great power status is hard. It's difficult to come to terms with, difficult to get your head around as a country. Now, of course, we in Britain have managed that entirely. The French, I'm not so sure about them. Now, joking apart, we are still working through our post-imperial sort of neuroses. We are still coming to terms with the fact that we are no longer globe-spanning great powers. Russia hasn't even started. And one of the reasons for that is Russia has always had an alibi. 1917, the collapse of the Tsarist Empire. Well, the Bolsheviks come in and all that bad stuff, that was the Tsars. Nothing to do with us. Post-Soviet Russia, all the bad stuff, that was the Bolsheviks. That was Stalin, that was Brezhnev, that was Andropov, that was even Gorbachev. Nothing to do with us. Russia has always managed to avoid coming to terms with its status, its new status. After all, as the inheritor of its nuclear weapons, it regains its seat on the Security Council. It can still feel that it is, a global nation in that respect. Its navy may be rusting, its only aircraft carrier, even in times of peace, unable to be sent out without several tugs to deal with it when, as it always did, it breaks down. It doesn't matter. The Russians can still tell themselves that they are a great power, and that anyone who doesn't recognize that is being Russophobic and a challenge. They are going to lose in Ukraine. I don't know how quickly, and I don't know exactly what loss looks like, but they are going to lose. And one can hope, and as I said, this is no more than a hope, that this will be for Russia what, for example, the Suez Crisis was for Britain, or the war in Algeria was for France. That moment of truth, that moment when reality imposes itself on your consciousness and says, you are no longer what you maybe once were. You have to start thinking of yourself rather differently, and you also have to think about what you have done, the road that you have taken to this place. Because until Russia can deal with its demons, and I know this is turning from geopolitics into psychotherapy, but until Russia can do that, then actually there can be no long-term security. We will just be basically finding different ways to build walls to protect ourselves from Russia. So maybe, in the very long term, actually Ukraine will help that. But in the meantime, thank heavens that Central Europe is doing what it is doing precisely to reinforce itself and thus to reinforce the entire West, that it is doing what it is doing to precisely secure and help Ukraine secure itself, and that people are at last paying attention to it. And I have 12 seconds left. Thank you very much for your attention. I will end now.